I adopted that phrase, queerer than we can suppose, to describe what I feel about certain aspects of science. And I suppose quantum theory is the obvious one, but actually even ordinary common sense science can sometimes feel very queer. Lewis Wolpert had a nice illustration. He said, every time you drink a glass of water or a cup of tea or beer, whatever it is, the probability is high that you are imbibing at least one molecule that passed through the bladder of Julius Caesar. And it's a probability argument. The number of molecules in a glass of water compared to the number of glasses of water there are in the entire world is such that the probability is that any particular molecule of water you will meet twice, or you will encounter it again. Well, that's not deeply mysterious in the way that quantum theory is mysterious, but it's very surprising.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing your evening with Professor Dawkins and myself this evening. We appreciate it. This is the third event that I've done with Richard. And the first event that I did with him, so I'm deaf in one ear, I'm deaf in this ear, that's why I always sit in the left chair. And often you can't see it from down here, but the lights are shining in your face. And the first time I did an event was during the question and answer. Somebody asked a question, and I couldn't understand a word they said, partially because of my deafness, and I couldn't see because I was blinded by the light. That's not a metaphor for anything. So I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. The next day, I received an email from a mother who said that Richard Dawkins was her hero and that I had shut her daughter down. And I just felt horrible. I felt terrible. So I told this to Richard. I said, oh my God, I screwed up. What are we going to do? So he sent me a book, a signed copy of the book, The Lovely Inscription. And I met with a woman and her daughter, and I gave him my first book, and I apologized. I said, I'm so sorry. This was a mistake. And one of the reasons that I tell you this story and that I open with this story is that Richard is an incredibly decent person. He's an incredibly kind person. And yes, he is, if not one of the world's foremost living public intellectuals, the foremost living public intellectuals who's made contributions to multiple domains of thought, unique in that area. But often, if not more than often, always, Richard will speak plainly about facts and evidence. And often if we speak plainly about facts and evidence, people accuse us of being pugilists or militant atheists, or they accuse us of being unkind. But I would argue, to paraphrase the great Thomas Sowell, it's exactly the opposite. Being nice to someone is different from being kind to them. If you want to do yourself a favor, you tell people what they want to hear. If you want to do them a favor, be honest with them, be truthful with them. Don't be afraid to speak bluntly and openly about facts and evidence. It's not an exaggeration to say that Richard Dawkins' work has changed my life. It's transformed me from the selfish gene and his other works. So I'm going to try something a little different this evening. I'm not going to come with questions that I already have the answers to. I'm going to come with things that I've been thinking about as I reflect on Richard's work over the years. And I want to think together with you in real time about these issues. I want to flesh these out. I think that there's a virtue in understanding, particularly Richard's thought process as we go through these areas. And I finished the book last night, his new book, Genetic Book of the Dead, which is extraordinary, which is also available here. So as we begin this evening, I'm looking forward to the question and answers. Think about, just as a way to conceptualize these problems. We're going to talk about memes. We're going to talk about an idea that I've been thinking about, queerer than you can suppose. And then we're going to launch into biology. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Please welcome famed evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins. Thank you. One of the things I was just saying, one of the things that I've always admired about your work is that you speak plainly and clearly about facts and evidence. And some might say you speak bluntly about facts and evidence. Why do you think it is that so many people who move in the public space, so many public intellectuals, obfuscate or do not speak clearly about facts and evidence?
Some subjects are very difficult to explain because they are complicated. And I think of modern physics, for example, which I find extremely hard to understand. And I could understand that a physicist might have great difficulty in conveying the more recondite aspects of the subject, quantum theory and relativity. Physics is genuinely difficult to understand, but I think there are other subjects which perhaps are not very difficult to understand, and I got a kind of sneaking suspicion that in some cases, intellectuals whose subject is actually not very deep try to pretend it is deeper than it is by obfuscating the language. And I've got a law, I call it Dawkins's law of conservation of obscurity, which goes like this. Obscurantism in an academic discipline expands to fill the vacuum of its intrinsic simplicity. You think that out. The word postmodernism springs to mind. And I don't know much about what it is, but I suspect that obscurantism may be part of the name of the game. Would that be? You probably know more about it than I do, Peter.
I think so. So postmodernism is basically the idea that there's no outside God's eye view. The philosopher Lyotard says that it's a skepticism of meta-narratives. Christianity is a meta-narrative. Any religion is a meta-narrative. Evolution would be a meta-narrative. Your late friend, who is very much of a mentor to me, Dan Dennett, told me that he had a conversation with Foucault. And he said when he tries to read his work, he doesn't understand much of it. And Foucault told him, that's because when you write in the French, if you write clearly, people will think you don't know what you're talking about.
Right, that's got it. Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
Yeah, so I see that a lot in gender studies and I think postmodern lingo when people stitch things together. So I want to delve into the weeds. I want to ask you a question. In your TED talk, you talked about this idea of queerer than you can suppose. And I
Okay.
find this, I've been thinking through this. Can you please explain that?
Yes. It's a quotation from J.B.S. Haldane, who is a great, or was a great British biologist, geneticist, biochemist, and philosopher. And he said something like this. Now, my suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And queer in this sense means strange. It doesn't mean what you might think it means. And I adopted that phrase, queerer than we can suppose, to describe what I feel about certain aspects of science. And I suppose quantum theory is the obvious one, but actually, even ordinary common sense science can sometimes feel very queer. Lewis Wolpert had a nice illustration. He said, every time you drink a glass of water or a cup of tea or beer, whatever it is, the probability is high that you are imbibing at least one molecule that passed through the bladder of Julius Caesar. And it's a probability argument. The number of molecules in a glass of water compared to the number of glasses of water there are in the entire world is such that the probability is that any particular molecule of water you will meet twice, or you will encounter it again. Well, that's not deeply mysterious in the way that quantum theory is mysterious, but it's very surprising. Another example that Wolpert uses is if you shoot a rifle horizontally and at the same moment drop a bullet from the muzzle of the rifle, they'll hit the ground at the same time. I mean, I can't do the physics, but these kinds of things, that's just queerer than we suppose, queerer than we can suppose. I suppose might mean the interpretations of quantum theory.
Okay. So you had a podcast with skeptic Michael Shermer, who's a mutual friend of ours, and I defended this idea of queerer than you can suppose. And the Australian philosopher and science educator puts out this really good demolition, 3-hour demolition of that idea. And I'm going to try to reduce that argument, and you tell me.
Well, I'm not familiar with it, so you'll have to do a good job.
Okay, I'm going to try. If I'm unclear, let me know. So the idea is basically nothing can be, for human minds, nothing can be queerer than we can suppose. And so if the idea is that our ancestors evolved to throw spears and kill gazelles on the savannah, those who were unsuccessful at that died off and didn't get to reproduce, and those who were successful at that got to reproduce. And over successive generations, one thing that happened was, I think you call it middle world in your TED talk. We understand really well the middle world.
Okay, middle world is the world between the very large relativity and the very small
quantum.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So we didn't evolve. It conferred no evolutionary advantage on us to understand what happens inside of black holes.
No.
Just as it conferred no evolutionary advantage upon us to understand double slit experiments or in the quantum. And so Brett Hall, getting this, who's a colleague of your colleague, David Deutsch, the physicist at Oxford, said that nothing is queerer than we can suppose because we can model everything. So, for example, we didn't evolve to understand UV light, or we didn't evolve to understand the evolution of the planets. But we do understand the evolution of the planets. We do understand electromagnetism.
Well,
that's one of the criticisms
But that's just a statement. I mean, it's true that we understand the solar system and we understand electromagnetic. Well, I don't, but I mean,
Right.
but don't forget, I mean, there was a time when people couldn't believe that anybody could live in Australia because they'd fall off. It's no argument. I mean, I'm not doing justice because I haven't actually read his
Beginning
argument.
of Infinity,
but to say because we already understand X, that means that we therefore must be capable of understanding Y, where Y is something. I mean, I could believe that there is some alien civilization where there are intelligent individuals who can understand things that we can't even begin to understand.
Okay, so
Just as a chimpanzee can't understand Pythagoras' theorem.
So this is where it gets a little contentious. So I'm an atheist, you're an atheist, Brett and David we're all atheists. So we don't need to impose any supernatural explanation for anything. So I think Deutsch would say, and I understand this is a very bizarre criticism, bear with me, is that the saying that we can't understand the quantum realm is akin to saying that we can't understand the supernatural. It's a kind of supernaturalism.
I would call it superhumanism, meaning there may be things which are not supernatural, but superhuman in the sense that humans can't understand them, but some superhuman aliens can.
If we can model it, though, like if we know what happens inside of a nuclear blast, which is there's no way we evolved to understand that, then we can understand our brains evolved to understand things far beyond what conferred an evolutionary advantage upon us. This is, and I've been wrestling with this for quite some time.
Yes. Well, David Deutsch believes in the many worlds interpretation of quantum theory,
Correct.
Where the many worlds interpretation, if we take the example of the hypothetical example of Schrödinger's cat, where Schrödinger proposed this as a way of ridiculing the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory, in which this cat is in a box. Probably you know the hypothetical example. It's in a box, and there's a killing mechanism which is triggered by a quantum event. And so the cat is shut up in the box, and you know that a quantum event might or might not have happened. So the cat might or may not be dead. According to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory, the cat is neither alive nor dead until you open the box, and then suddenly it becomes either alive or dead. Well, Schrödinger proposed that as a way of ridiculing the whole idea of the Copenhagen interpretation. David Deutsch believes in the many worlds interpretation, which is that the world is constantly branching and producing new worlds, and there are many worlds in which the cat is alive and many worlds in which the cat is dead. And already in our particular world, the cat is either alive or dead, and we don't know until we open the box. But there are another millions of worlds in which the cat is alive or dead. By the way, there's a lovely cartoon in the New Yorker I saw a few years ago, which was in a veterinary surgeon's waiting room, and there were people there with their pet dogs and their lampshades on and things. And the nurse was coming out, and she was saying to one of the people sitting there, "About your cat, Mr. Schrödinger, I have some good news and some bad news." Anyway, David Deutsch believes in the many worlds interpretation, which is that the cat is alive in some worlds and dead in others. Well, now that is, at least that doesn't totally defy common sense. It does defy economy. It's a ridiculously uneconomic idea.
Unparsimonious
idea. But unlike the Copenhagen interpretation, it's not just horrible. And
does the fact that he can posit that, or does the fact that you can make an eloquent argument for the self as gene, does that mean that things are not queerer than we can suppose?
Well, no, because the selfish gene is relatively simple, and the there are a few people who are clever enough, maybe, to understand quantum theory, but I don't know how you can be so confident that there are not other things which nobody can understand, in the same way as a dog can't understand Newton's laws.
You gave the example in your TED Talk of dogs who smell and water striders. And the consciousness of a water strider, those little bugs that just float on top of the water, of a water strider, and our consciousness, the way we've evolved, we cannot understand. So I'm thinking, is the difficulty maybe in the idea that what we mean by understand? Because I think Deutsch would say that if you can model it, you can understand it.
Yes. I'm not sure about that.
I don't know either.
David Deutsch is an incredibly clever man, and highly original, and everything he says sounds odd until you think about it further and you think how brilliant it is. And so I wouldn't like to put myself against him. I wouldn't like to have a debate with him. I'd lose.
About physics, at least.
Well, certainly about physics, yes.
I'll be on your team when it comes to the biology edition of some game.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about your book. So in the Genetic Book of the Dead, you talk about a palimpsest. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. The idea of the book is that the central idea is that the animal is a book, a description of the ancestral worlds in which its ancestors lived. Oh, by the way, I should announce, I forgot this, very kindly, the owner of the standard book handle has provided a limited number of the Dutch edition of this book. Oh. I was unaware that the Dutch edition had even come out. I knew it was being published. And when I arrived today, I discovered, to my great surprise and delight, that the Dutch edition is indeed here. And so no advanced provision had been made to provide it. There are English editions. And so we went around Antwerp today trying to find bookshops that had copies of the Dutch edition, and found two, actually. And so Patrick, the manager of the standard book handle, is here, and he will be selling the Dutch edition after this, and I'm very grateful to him for coming round so rapidly.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So the palimpsest.
Palimpsest, okay. The idea is that the animal is a written description of its ancestral worlds. And to persuade you of this, think about a highly camouflaged animal. An animal I've got a picture of in the book of a desert lizard. Lizard lives in the desert and it's highly camouflaged. So it has a picture of desert on its back. It has little stones and pebbles, little grains of sand. It looks exactly like a desert, printed on its back, painted on its back. The detail of such an animal, and many other camouflaged animals, is uncanny. Highly detailed perfection. My thesis is that that detailed perfection cannot be limited to the skin. There's no reason why it should be. It must pervade the entire animal, right down to the individual cells, right down to the depths of the animal. But of course, it's much more difficult for us to see it. Our naked eyes are equipped to see the perfection of camouflage, because camouflage is designed to deceive eyes, predator eyes. And it works on our eyes too. So our eyes can see the perfection of camouflage. Our eyes cannot see the perfection of the internal details of the animal, but they must be there. They must be equally perfect. So that's the thesis, that the animal is a written description. I got a quote from Darwin, which I think conveys the thing that Darwin must have had a similar idea. this is quoted in the book, "It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers." So that's Darwin saying essentially the same thing. Now, I think what that means is that the natural selection pressures in the animal's ancestry that worked to produce the animal the way it is on its ancestors, I think of it as like a sculptor chiseling away with fine, sharp chisels at the gene pool of the ancestors to produce the perfection of the animal. There must be signals from the past in the animal today telling us about what those chisels were, what the sculptor's chisels were like. The animal must contain a description of the ancestral natural selection pressures that shaped it. Palimpsest is a document that has been partially erased and then written over. In the days before paper was plentiful, documents were, the paper or parchment on which documents were written was precious, and so they tended to erase and then write over. Well, because the selection pressure on the ancestors are from all sorts of different ages past, very ancient, a bit more recent, a bit more recent, a bit more recent, it must be the description of the past, which is the animal, must be a palimpsest of ancient descriptions, and then overlaying that more recent descriptions, and then overlaying that more recent descriptions still. My conjecture is that a biologist of the future will be able to read the animal and read all the layers of the palimpsest and reconstruct the ancestral worlds which have shaped the way the animal is today.
It's fascinating. And that the same mechanism, I would assume, applies to humans.
Of course.
There's nothing special about us.
No, we are animals. It applies to us too.
So I want to talk about some specifics in the book. One of the things that you wrote about in the book is, I remember years ago, I saw a video of you dissecting a giraffe.
Yes. This was done for a television program. A giraffe had unfortunately died in a zoo in England, and I was invited to come and assist. I didn't do the dissecting myself. I'm not a skilled enough anatomist, but I kind of passed the scalpel when it was needed. And the reason for doing this was that there is in vertebrates, in mammals, let's stick to mammals for a moment, a nerve called the recurrent laryngeal, which is one of the cranial nerves. It starts in the brain, and the end organ is the larynx, the voice box. But instead of going straight to the larynx, it does a tremendous detour. It goes down into the chest, loops its way around a big artery in the chest, and then goes back up again to the larynx. In a giraffe, that is a very considerable detour. Not great design. So it was, the interest of this television program was to dissect this nerve and see the length of the detour. And it was fascinating to watch as the anatomist doing the dissection, I was assisting her, was gradually teasing it out. And we watched it go straight down the neck of the giraffe, straight past the larynx. It passed within a few centimeters of the larynx, went screaming straight past the larynx, right down into the chest, and then back up again. A very large detour. In a large sauropod dinosaur, it would have been even longer. The explanation for it lies in history. The origin of this nerve in our ancestry, in our fish ancestors, it originally went direct to one of the gills. And the direct path then was south of, you might pardon the word, it was posterior to the artery concerned. Fish don't have a neck. When in the evolution of reptiles and then mammals, the neck started to lengthen, At each little millimeter of increase of length of the neck, 2 millimeters was added to the detour, to the nerve. The marginal cost of each additional millimeter is negligible compared to the major cost of the embryological upheaval of jumping the nerve over the artery. That would have been a major change in embryology, a major upheaval in embryology. And if you think about it, it's the marginal cost that matters. And so the explanation is that as the neck got longer and longer and longer and longer, the detour only got a little tiny bit longer. And so the disadvantage of increasing the length of the detour was small compared to the massive disadvantage of changing the whole course of embryology to move the nerve to the other side of the artery. So the explanation lies in evolutionary history, and I would defy any creationist to explain why God would do that.
So that was going to be my next question. It's obvious when you see it, when you watch the video, and when you read the book, you explain that. What is a creationist argument for why there would be an unintelligent? Because the argument is that everything has an intelligent design, but that is clearly an unintelligent design.
Yes, that's right. In the case of another example, which is that the vertebrate retina in the eye is back to front. You know, the light-sensitive cells in a mollusk eye. Mollusks also, octopuses, for example, also have a camera eye, and they have a retina with light-sensitive cells, and the nerves leading from the light-sensitive cells to the brain come backwards from the retina to the brain. That's the sensible design. In us and in all vertebrates, it's not like that. The light-sensitive cells are pointing backwards, away from where the light's coming from. And so the nerves connecting the retinal cells to the brain have to travel over the surface of the retina, and then they dive through the retina in the blind spot. Well, the great German biologist and physicist Helmholtz said that if an engineer had given him the vertebrate eye, he would have sent it back. You ask what a creationist would say. Well, the fact is that vertebrates, we actually do see better than octopuses. We see better than mollusks. And the reason is that although there's this initial major design flaw, the retina being backwards, natural selection comes up and cleans up afterwards and has made a pretty good job of providing a fairly good bit of optical kit by subsequent tinkering, chiseling away and improving things, even given the fundamental design flaw. It doesn't matter all that much that the retina is back to front. It probably would be a little bit better if it was the right way round. But once again, the cost of changing it, imagine trying to change the entire embryology of the eye. It couldn't be done. I mean, or if you did it, if you tried to do it, the animals would be blind for millions of years while they got their act together.
And there'd be simply no reason to design an organism like that.
It's a historical accident. That's right. I mean, if it was an intelligent designer, they certainly would not have done it like that.
Not very intelligent.
It's a historical accident. It's because of the way in embryology the eye develops, and it works pretty well because, as I say, natural selection comes and cleans up afterwards.
I wanted to talk about a couple of other things in your book that I found really interesting. You gave the example of birds and the broken wing, or birds pretending.
Oh, yes.
Would the word pretending be right?
Okay. There's a fascinating display shown by a large number of birds when they ground nesting birds, when they're being threatened, when their nest is threatened by a predator like a fox. They pretend they've got a broken wing and they lure the fox or the predator away from the nest, so the wing hangs out like that and they kind of limp or shuffle away. from the nest. And the fox, I suppose you could say, thinking that the bird itself is a bigger reward than the eggs in the nest. So the fox goes after the parent bird, which is pretending to have a broken wing. And then finally it does take off because the wing is not actually broken. Now, there are two things I want to say about this. One is that you might be tempted to think that the bird has thought it out, has worked out that this would be a good way to lure a fox away. And it's possible that's the way it is, but it's much more likely natural selection has worked upon the genes of the ancestors of the bird and has selected those genes that program brains that behave like clockwork. And without the bird having the faintest idea why it's doing it, causes it to do it, just like a clockwork toy. That's the one thing I wanted to say. The other thing is that this fascinating Darwinian adaptation has evolved not once, but dozens of times independently. There's a diagram in the book, in the Genetic Book of the Dead, which shows the entire taxonomy, the whole family tree of birds. And because it's so big, you can't fit it on the page, and so it's done as a circle. So it's like a great big family tree, but bent round in a circle. And the incidence of the broken wing display is colored in red or some color. And you can see it's sporadic all the way around the family tree of birds. Here, there. This is showing that many times, I think it's dozens of times, tens of times, 20 times maybe, I forget to count what the count is, this display has independently evolved, convergently, independently. This is one of the fascinating things about evolution, is that a good idea usually doesn't just happen once. It happens again and again and again.
So I'm hesitant to anthropomorphize, and we said, is it safe to say, or does the idea of it pretending not come into it? Or is that just my human interpretation that the bird is pretending to have a broken beak? Or is it just doing what it evolved to do with no thought?
I don't mind using the word pretend, because knowing that I and the audience who are listening to me are capable of translating back into respectable Darwinian language. I cannot deny the possibility that the bird is deliberately pretending to do it. But certainly the school of thought in which I was brought up, that of Nico Tinbergen, the great Dutch ethologist, would be we leave open the question of what the bird's motive might be. We simply regard it as a piece of clockwork. You know those toys where you pull a string and it's a doll, and it says one of a dozen stupid phrases.
Yeah.
It's sort of like that. The bird, an animal has a number of instinctive action patterns, which are built in by the genes, and which go off like clockwork. And the animal doesn't have to know why it does them. We assume it doesn't know why we don't assume one way or the other. We don't assume that it has any idea why it's doing it. It has these clockwork patterns. In some cases, you can be pretty sure it doesn't know what it's doing. For example, people who keep dogs have probably seen them burying a bone in the carpet, so that the dog has a clockwork instinctive pattern of burying a bone. And in nature, they would dig a hole and bury it, and then they would shovel soil on top of the bone. And they do it with the nose like that. Now, I've seen several dogs, and you've probably seen several dogs doing this on a bare floor, pushing with the nose against and there's no soil to push. It's just pushing. This is an instinctive clockwork pattern, which is just going off like clockwork. And the dog doesn't know why it's doing it. It just has this action pattern going off like clockwork. An even more spectacular example, beavers, as you know, build dams. And in nature, what they do is they collect sticks, twigs, branches, and they pile them up in the dam. There's a wonderful film on YouTube. If you Google beaver dummy dam or something like that, it's indoors in a house, and the beaver is building a dam out of old bits of toys and teddy bears and carpet and pillows and cushions and things, and it's going along the corridor, dragging things and pushing them into the dam. It's damming the corridor up with. So it's not a river at all. These aren't the beaver simply has this urge to build a dam. I've seen a film, as even better film, a German film, in which the beaver is in a completely blank, empty room with a concrete floor, nothing in the room at all, and it's picking up phantom branches and dragging them and plonking them down to where the phantom dam is. These are called vacuum activities, and they demonstrate that the animal is going off like clockwork without knowing why it's doing it.
And no pretending. So back to the bird, I have
Yes.
two pedestrian questions. So when the bird okay, there I go with pretend. But when the bird feigns having a broken wing and it leads the fox away from the nest, why doesn't the fox just go back and eat the eggs?
I suppose the hope is that the fox has been distracted onto something else by then. I mean,
okay.
It's a very good question, and maybe sometimes it does.
So the other question that I had when I read that is that why wouldn't the foxes evolve? Why wouldn't the foxes die out? Like, is there an evolutionary explanation for the foxes who fell for the broken wing thing? Why wouldn't they die out, whereas the foxes would live if they just ate all the eggs?
Good question. There's an arms race between predators and prey, and the arms race is just one example, but in any arms race, when one animal gets ahead, the other one evolves a counter-adaptation, and then a counter-adaptation, and so on. And arms races are almost certainly why animals are so beautifully complicated. If animals only were adapted to survive the weather and grow long hair when it's cold and short hair when it's hot, then you wouldn't see the magnificent, elegant, complicated things that we do see. The reason we see them is arms races. Arms races between predators and prey, arms races between parasites and hosts. And so, and the reason why cheetahs run fast is that antelopes run fast, and the reason why antelopes run fast is that cheetahs run fast, and it's escalated over the past. Escalation. So there will be an arms race between the broken wing displayers and the foxes, so to speak, and what we're seeing is the arms race in progress. And it may be that some foxes are not fooled, and in the future maybe the broken wing display will die out. I mean, we don't know that, but at any stage we are watching the arms race in progress.
And it's not even specious, but it's just not the way to think about it, that there's a built-in, as I've heard many people discuss evolution, that there's a telos to it. There's an end. We don't know what the end is.
There's no end. There's no telos. It's always the moment-to-moment advantage. It's always getting a little bit better than it was before. It's never aiming towards a distant end.
Okay, and so eventually we'll see if we'll just play out between the birds that have broken wings and the foxes who chase them, and then there's some foxes that don't chase them, they eat the eggs, and maybe the ones who chase the broken wings will die out.
That may be. In some cases, you could say that the arms race ends in victory for one side or the other. I mean, in the case of cuckoos, for example, which is another chapter in the book about cuckoos, you've probably seen pictures of a young cuckoo being fed by its foster parent. Cuckoos lay their eggs in the nest of other species and fool the other species into bringing the cuckoo up. And the odd thing is that towards the end before the baby cuckoo fledges, it can be many, many, many times larger than its foster parent. So in other words, the foster parent is just being a complete idiot. I mean, it couldn't possibly be one of its own children. It can be 10 times as big as the foster parent. So in this case, it looks as though the cuckoo has won the arms race.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's an arms race, which for some reason is victory for one side or the other. It's possible that the reason for victory in this case is something we can call I've called it the John Krebs and I wrote a paper on the arms races, and we called it the life dinner principle. It comes from Aesop's fables. In one of Aesop's fables, there was a predator, I think he was a hound in this case, running after a hare. And the hare always ran faster than the hound. And somebody said, well, how pathetic, why don't you catch the hare? And the hound said, the hare is running for his life. I'm only running for my dinner. So there's an asymmetry in the arms race. The cost of failure is greater on one side than the other. That could be one reason why an arms race might end in victory for one side or the other. Another one we suggested was the rare enemy effect. Cuckoos are not that common. What this means is that the foster parent, it might be a wren, a tiny wren. The wren, its ancestors may have rather seldom met a cuckoo, but the ancestors of the cuckoo, every single one of them has managed to fool a foster parent without exception.
Interesting.
So again, there's an asymmetry, the cost of failure. The selection pressure on the cuckoos is stronger because there's not a single ancestor of the cuckoos that has ever failed to fool a foster parent. There are plenty of foster parents who have maybe been fooled by a cuckoo and lived to live another day or never even met a cuckoo.
Okay, so you're going to have to slow down when I ask you this question because I for the life of me, I cannot understand it. Why would a turtle go from the sea to the land back to
Okay, this is an example.
Help me, please.
Okay, this is one of my favorite examples in the book. Excuse me. As you know, we all come from fish, and fish. Some of them came out onto the land, and that's fair enough. And then some of those land animals, mammals say, and reptiles, went back to the water.
Right.
Whales went back to the water. Dugongs and manatees went back to the water. Seals and sea lions went partially back to the water, but they spent a lot of time on land. Turtles went back to the water. They just come back on land in order to breed. But turtles, then some of them turned turtle and came back onto the land again to live on land, and in some cases in the desert, because tortoises, what the English call tortoises, give you a little English lesson. Difference between American English and British English. In British English, a tortoise lives on land, and a turtle lives in the water. In American English, they're all turtles.
Right.
But I have to, as it were, climb down a bit on this because as I've shown in the book, some sea turtles came back onto the land and became tortoises. So when an American talks about a desert turtle, I have to give up flinching, which I always used to. How dare you talk about a desert turtle? But actually, it's fair enough, because their ancestors, they were fish, they came on land and became land tortoises. We have fossil evidence for that. They went back to the sea and became turtles, and they came back on land again and became land tortoises, including desert tortoises. So that's the only doubling back I know.
But, okay, so I get the description that happened, but I don't, and I can get how it goes from the water to the land. And I guess I can kind of, if I do enough mental gymnastics, figure out how it got back to the water. But I can't make that other step of how it got back.
Well, each of those steps is difficult enough. I mean, it's difficult enough in a way, thinking why a perfectly good fish, which is very happy in the water, should come out on land.
Yeah.
And there are various theories about this, and some of them are very interesting. I mean, it's possible that what happened was that some fish found themselves in pools which were left by the high tide, drying out, and they would have died if they couldn't flop their way to another pool. So then, having done that, their descendants might have flopped their way to a slightly more distant pool, and so on. So that's the kind of theory that takes care of why come out on land. Then why go back into the water?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. The fossil evidence in the case of whales is very good. There's a very good fossil record of the transition between land animals, the ancestors of whales, which went back to the water. By the way, the whales are most closely related to hippopotamuses. It's a very strange, surprising thing. Hippopotamuses their closest cousins are whales. It doesn't mean that the ancestor was a hippo. It means that the common ancestor was something which gave rise to hippos and to whales much later. So whatever this common ancestor was, it seemed to find a good living to be made by going back to the water, and plenty of other animals do it. There are the Galapagos marine iguanas, which spend a lot of time on land, but they go back to the water to fish. Wherever there's a living to be made, somebody will exploit it. There are already fish in the sea, so why would an animal go back into the sea since fish are doing such a good job? Well, I suppose because you can eat fish. I mean, I don't know. As for why they came back out onto the land again, I don't know, and I can make it worse for you. It happened twice. It happened way back in the Triassic, in the era before the dinosaurs, although the dinosaurs were just beginning. There was an earlier incarnation of tortoises coming out of the sea onto the land, and there are fossil land tortoises which died out now, from which our modern tortoises are not descended. Our modern tortoises are descended from more recent. So this doubling back not only happened, it happened twice, once in the Triassic and once more recently.
So you mentioned hippopotamus, and in your book you have a picture of a little insect with that looks like a hippopotamus.
No, rhinoceros.
Yeah, rhinoceros, and it's like going to war with another insect. And the idea is that it's not a matter of scale. They still use the same.
Yes, I use this as a rather fanciful example of convergent evolution. There's a chapter on convergent evolution. I mentioned this already with respect to the broken wing display, and I mentioned it also in the case of there are lots of different moles. The mole way of life has evolved about 4 times independently. Animals that dig underground and have little shovel-shaped paws, and involved in Australia, marsupial moles, in Africa, golden moles, and in the old world, insectivorous moles. Well, how do we get into this? I got distracted.
Well, no, because I was just thinking, I wonder if there are.
Oh, this rhinoceros beetle.
Yeah.
Yes. And another example is the rhinoceros beetle, which is obviously not like a. I mean, it looks like a tiny rhinoceros.
Yeah.
It's a sort of convergence, but and it uses its horns in the same kind of way. The difference being that because of scale, matters of scale, it can actually lift a rival right up, whereas a proper rhinoceros can't do that because of the effects of scale. The fact that mass goes up as the cube of the linear dimension.
Are there any other examples in which larger animals have some kind of, I don't know, militaristic or predatory tactic to hunt prey or to fight with each other, and that manifest in smaller animals?
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there. I mean, if you look at spiders hunting and insects hunting, you can see resemblances to lions and things. I suppose, is that the kind of thing you mean?
Well, I'm trying to think of. I'm not sure exactly what I mean. I'm thinking out loud here. I'm just wondering if there's some kind of a constant in the world that could. So this is again the idea of thinking out loud, thinking based upon these ideas. If there's something like, the antlers that butt each other.
Yes.
If there's something that plays out among smaller animals.
Well, there are. I mean, there are beetles that have what look like antlers. Yes. Yes.
So I'm wondering then if there are kind of constants, like we know that through evolution, certain things work, certain designs, certain mechanisms.
Yes.
And I know that we've tried to design planes and cars pulling from the animal kingdom to see what lessons can be learned. I don't know in the age of drone warfare if that's useful at all. But.
Yes. I mean, I did mention this matter of scale, but I mean, it is a very significant fact that as you make the linear dimension of anything bigger, the area goes up as the square of the linear dimension, but the weight, the mass, goes up as the cube of the linear dimension. So that means that you can't just scale up. If you were to take something like a spider with its long spindly legs, you couldn't scale that up to make a spider the size of an elephant, because the mass of the thing would go up as the cube of the linear dimension. And so it would need great big tree trunks of legs, which is what an elephant or a dinosaur has, in order to support it. So you can't just scale it up. The shape of the thing has got to change in order to accommodate this fundamental physical law that mass goes up as the cube of the linear dimension. But by the same token, if there was a planet on which gravity was much stronger than on Earth, then an animal the size of a spider would have to have legs like an elephant. Conversely, on Mars, say, where the gravity is much weaker, if there were rhinoceros-sized animals or elephant-sized animals on Mars, they could afford to have spindly legs.
Wow.
So you could, yes, okay.
And I would imagine when you went to another planet with a different gravity, they would not fare well because they didn't evolve to those environments.
Oh no, they wouldn't. That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Certainly not.
Your legs would be broken.
Yes.
If you went from lighter gravity to strong gravity.
Yeah.
We're almost at the Q&A, but I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions. One of the first events we did together, at the end of the event, there was a book signing, and I was just incredibly moved when people would come up to you and say, like, literally person after person after person, and I tweeted this out. I eventually pulled out my phone and I started tweeting exactly what people say to you, like, Richard Dawkins, you've changed my life, Richard Dawkins, and people were just like literally crying there, and then I started tearing up, and then I was just so struck by that, and I want to ask you, what are you most proud of?
Well, that story you just told, I mean, that does happen. I have to confess, it does happen. Partly, I mean, quite a lot of people say that my books have persuaded them to take up a career in biology or even in science, then that's immensely gratifying. Sometimes they say that I've helped them to lose their religious faith, and that's pretty gratifying too. But I suppose actually they often say that I've articulated what they already thought, but didn't know how to put into words. I mean, they said that as well. One of the things that I do find gratifying is that I think I've been eclipsed by several of my own pupils.
Wow.
And I think that's a very gratifying thing. I think there might be some people who don't like that, but I think it's wonderful.
Well, that's pretty extraordinary. I just, in closing, before we do the Q&A, I want to thank you because your books have changed my life, and they've made me really understand the value and the power of science and reason and rationality, and really trying to do public outreach and work to promote those things. And I'm incredibly grateful for what you've given me. So I'd like to thank you so much. Okay, so we have a Q&A now, and we have a line. Can we shed some light? We can't see anything. We have a 2-line for the Q&A. And if you have any questions for Professor Dawkins, please don't hesitate to ask. There's a microphone right over there, and we'll go just in straight order. Okay, this is very important now. No soliloquies, no diatribes, just a simple question, as brief as possible. Excuse me. That way we'll get as many questions as possible throughout this. Hello.
Hello.
We can't hear you.
Oh, I can shout. Okay.
Excellent. Perfect.
Hi. This is a question I just thought of. When I think about the life cycle of some creatures that seem quite horrific, they can only survive if they lay their eggs in another creature's brain and then they grow out of their eyes or something like that. Those creatures that just, when you read about them, it just seems so horrific. And I'm wondering, when you study those creatures, do you ever sort of feel that nature's really cruel, or what does that make you feel as a person?
Yes.
It's a great question.
Magnificent question. Yes, I mean, these things are ubiquitous. Parasites often need to get from a secondary host to a definite host, to a definitive host. So it may be that they need to parasitize a snail or an ant, say, and then they have to get from the snail or the ant into a sheep or a cow. And so what they do is they manipulate the behavior of the sheep, of the ant or the snail, in order to make it more vulnerable to being swallowed by a sheep. There are parasites that need to get into water, and they live in an insect on land, and they have to get into water to get into their definitive host. And so they burrow into the brain of the host, which might be a cricket, it might be a beetle, it might be a bee, and they cause the animal to dive into water. And then the animal bursts and releases the parasite. There are many, many hideous examples like this. The ichneumon wasps, which studied by Fabre, the great French naturalist, what they do is they lay their eggs in another insect or a spider or some kind of prey like that. It might be a caterpillar, it might be a grasshopper, and they sting it to paralyze it, not to kill it, because if they killed it, then when they lay their egg in it and the larva hatches out, let's call it a caterpillar, the caterpillar would decay, which would be no good to the larva. So they sting it to paralyze it so that it's still alive and kept fresh for the young larva to feed on. Darwin himself said, I cannot conceive that a benevolent deity could possibly have created the ichneumonidae. He was so horrified by this thing of paralyzing them. It actually, the prey caterpillar has a number of ganglia down the ventral side. And it has a main nerve cord down the ventral side, not the dorsal side, but down the ventral side. And according to Fabre, it actually stings each ganglion in turn in order to effect this paralysis. So Darwin was actually horrified. It actually contributed to Darwin's loss of faith.
Wow.
The very question that the questioner has raised.
Great question. Next. Speak into the mic, please.
You described quite lively how the behavior of a dog is inscribed in his genes. And I wonder if also religion is described in some way in our genes. And of course, the question, if it's so, how can we get rid of this genetic burden?
Yes, this is possible. It's not in a direct sense, but you could say that something about our brains, which are determined by embryology, which is determined by genes, makes us susceptible to not just religion, but all the things that we believe and are susceptible to believing. So it's perfectly possible that there are, in some sense, a genetic tendency to religion, and you could even study variation among humans, variation in tendency to religiosity. Twin studies are a way of dissecting out the contribution to variance of various things, including religion. So what you do is you take monozygotic twins that have the same genome, identical twins, and fraternal twins who are just like ordinary siblings, ordinary brothers and sisters. And you take both of those categories who have been reared apart and reared together. So you have identical twins reared together, identical twins reared apart, fraternal twins reared together, fraternal twins reared apart. And by doing statistics on those, there aren't many identical twins reared apart, but there are enough to do the statistics. You do statistics and you can calculate the contribution to the variance of genes. And this has been done with IQ, it's been done with height, with weight, with musical ability, all sorts of things. And I don't know if it's been done on religiosity, but I would bet that you would find there is a hereditary component to religiosity, because why wouldn't you? I mean, it affects everything else. So yes, I think you're right. I think there probably is a genetic component. Where you might be wrong is in thinking that if you have this genetic tendency to be religious, you can't get away from it, because that's not what genes do. They're not necessarily irrevocably dictatorial like that. You can have a genetic tendency to be religious, but you can overcome it by education and reasoning.
Thank you. Next question, please. Speak right into the mic and ask your question.
Good evening. This is much more interesting than dragons.
I got the reference.
So my question is, Professor Dawkins, where do you think we will evolve from now on?
Well, if you are looking to biological evolution there, the future of biological evolution, I suppose you're probably thinking something like in 2 million years' time or 3 million years' time, what would humans look like? If you look back 3 million years, what our ancestors looked like, we know what they looked like. We've got fossils. They looked like Australopithecus. They were upright, walking on their hind legs, but they had brains about the size of a chimpanzee or slightly bigger than a chimpanzee. So the dramatic change that has happened in the last 3 million years is an increase in brain size. Is that likely to continue for the next 3 million years? Well, in order for that to happen, it would be necessary that the brainiest individuals are the ones who have the most children. I don't think it's likely that we can see a simple extrapolation of the trend of the last 3 million years. If you ask what it is that causes some people to have lots of children and other people to have none or fewer, there could be all sorts of reasons. And if any of them have a genetic component, then by definition, we do have natural selection. If one were to divide humans into all the ones who have lots of children there and all the ones who have no children there, and then look for genes that those have in common and those don't, and vice versa, then by definition we have natural selection in favor of those genes and against those genes. But in order for that to have an evolutionary consequence, the selection pressure would have to persist for thousands of years. Now, whatever it is that separates those people from those people, it's in the current cultural climate, it seems unlikely to persist for thousands of years. The reason why some people have lots of children and others don't is likely to be cultural, it could be religious, it could be all sorts of things. Whatever it is, it's likely to change much more at a much higher rate than genetic evolution. And so I think we can't probably make any extrapolation that way. So I'm going to funk that question. I have no prediction to make about future human evolution, unless we split into two different separate populations by colonizing Mars or something, so that there's no gene flow or very little gene flow between them. Then you might actually see some kind of divergence. And as I was talking about earlier, you might start to get people with very long, spindly legs.
Thank you for your question. Next, ask your question, please.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you for joining us. When we programmed the first computer, we basically taught a piece of rock how to do math. And with the emergence of artificial intelligence, do you think it could be an extension of our own evolution, or has it changed the way we look at life and when we search for life in outside in outer space?
The British astronomer royal, Martin Rees, Lord Rees, has speculated that if we ever encounter alien intelligence, it's likely to be not the biological creators of that intelligence, but the artificial intelligences that they have made. He speculates that the lifespan of biological intelligence is likely to be rather small, rather short, compared to the subsequent lifespan of the artificial progeny, if we could call it that. And so it could very well be that that our future is going to be a future in silico rather than in biology, and the soft, wet, squishy things that we are may disappear, and in future an auditorium like this may be filled with metal and silicon robots.
Nick Bostrom calls it what we have now, the meat brain. Thank you for your question. Next, please.
Hello. Dragons were mentioned. So can I ask, I'd be very curious to learn from your further reflections after your discussion with Jordan Peterson on what can be perhaps literally false but metaphorically true.
Oh, yes, the Jordan Peterson question. I have had two discussions with Jordan Peterson. One was simply recorded sound, and the second one was the one you're probably referring to, which took place quite recently, a few weeks ago, in Arizona. He's an interesting man. I have great respect for the courageous stand which he took against ludicrous Canadian laws forcing people to call people by their preferred pronouns, whether they want to or not. But I have trouble with his philosophy, where he seems to be really not that interested in facts and obsessed with symbols and Jungian archetypes. So when, for example, well, you mentioned dragons, he talked about dragons, and I said, well, do you think dragons actually exist? And he said, well, what about tigers and predators and Tyrannosaurus and things like that? And I said, well, they're tigers and Tyrannosauruses. They're not dragons, but to him, they carry the same symbolic, metaphorical, archetypal weight as a dragon. And so it doesn't matter whether dragons actually exist. What matters is their symbolic significance. It doesn't matter that Adam and Eve never existed. Adam and Eve are symbolic. It doesn't matter that Cain and Abel never existed. Cain and Abel are symbolic of the archetype, the Jungian archetype of fratricide and jealous brothers. So I think he just doesn't care about facts. And I care about facts. And we just had to agree to differ about that.
Okay, next question, please.
Dr. Dawkins, thank you for joining us tonight and letting us probe your mind. You've announced this tour as being your swan song. And I was wondering, how do you feel about singing your swan song in these trying times where science denial is on the rise? Are you still optimistic about the future? And if so, where do you find this optimism? Because I can't seem to find it right now.
Yes. Actually, I was a little bit misunderstood. I said that my recent tour of America was to be my American swan song. I didn't really mean it to apply to the rest of the world. And after the events of November the 5th, I rather reinforced my feeling about, well, no, but you ask a serious question that it is a time when we need scientific rationalism. And so perhaps, yes, I mean, we all need to do our bit to foster critical thinking, which Peter's made a career of fostering critical thinking, and we all need to do that.
What gives you optimism as we face the future? What are you optimistic about? New technologies.
Yes, I mean, I don't know whether you've read Steven Pinker's book,
Enlightenment Now.
The
Better Angels.
Better Angels of Our Nature, and Rationality Now, or
Enlightenment Now.
Enlightenment Now. Steven Pinker, who's a man I have enormous respect for, a beautiful writer, wonderful intellectual, has looked historically at human progress. And he means progress. I mean, he really does show, I think, historically that despite vicissitudes, despite going back and forth in a bit of a sawtooth, we are getting better in the long term. I mean, we don't have public spectacles of gladiators fighting to the death for public entertainment like the Romans did in the Colosseum. We don't torture animals to death for entertainment, at least most of us don't. We treat women as equals, which is a phenomenon that really has only been developing in the 20th century. But all these things are moving in the right direction. There are a few that move in the wrong direction, but that's a temporary thing. And violent death from interhuman violence, homicide, is going down if you look in the long term. In our hunter-gatherer ancestors, if we can judge from existing evidence, homicide was far more common, and that even takes into account modern warfare. So I think there are grounds for optimism in that book, and Michael Shermer, our friend Michael Shermer, has written a similar book.
The moral arc bends towards justice.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly a good book and powerful theme from Martin Luther King. The moral arc of history does bend towards justice, and he draws from Pinker in that book. Okay, next question. Speak in the mic and ask your question, please.
Hi. Thank you very much for your amazing work. And I would love to kindly ask you for clarification of something at the beginning of the event, which I admit a little bit angered me, so I need a clarification.
Okay.
I perceived a dismissive use and puns at the word queer and gender studies. From one side, gender studies academically critical and so on and so on. And I would love you to clarify perhaps that for me.
I could take that if you want.
Quite hear that.
So let me make sure I understand the question. Professor Dawkins has this thing, queerer than you can suppose, but it doesn't mean like when we think of the word queer, I'm 58. We used to call people queers if they were gay, and it was a pejorative term. It was a negative term. And so what he's saying, it has nothing to do with sexuality. It's just more bizarre. So the word queer means more bizarre than you can suppose, than we can imagine, but it doesn't mean anything of anybody's sexuality.
This was a quote from J.B.S. Haldane, who was using the word queer before it meant homosexual.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought so, but I just perceived some slight, and this was my mistake, and that's why I'm here to clarify.
No, we're glad you asked.
Okay,
sure.
You're right. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. I wanted to ask, in our daily lives, like you mentioned the example about the dog putting its nose to the carpet, how many times we put our noses to the carpet without knowing it and thinking with our prefrontal cortexes, we don't do that anymore.
I didn't quite get that.
So let me see if I understood what you're saying. So just as dogs, or maybe beavers, build imaginary dams, or dogs, when there's no dirt, they still try to bury bones. Is there something that human beings do that's analogous or isomorphic? Is there something that beings do like that?
Okay,
yeah, and that we're not self-aware of. We think we are, but we're not.
Great question.
That's a great question. I'm not sure about I can't think of actually doing something. I can think of being a male human being lustful to a photograph, which he knows perfectly well is not a real
That's a great answer. Okay, next question.
I have a small question stating from your opening statement. You said, I'm not talking to you, Dr. Dawkins.
Me?
Yeah,
Peter.
actually. You said there is no biological advantage I can find in my mind to understand how an A-bomb works. But I dare to hypothesize that the idea of having neural capacity in your brains to activate fixed action patterns, just like the birds acting like they're wounded, would leave room for more open neural space, being able to accept other information and to adapt accordingly. Wouldn't that be a significant enough evolutionary driver?
So the basic, let me make sure I understand your question correctly. So the idea is when something is queerer than you can suppose, that we all understand things in middle world. We understand throwing spears at gazelles. We got that. The philosopher A.J. Ayer calls it middle-sized dry goods. We got that. But what happens when you get to the realm of the very, very big and the very, very small? Is there something fundamental in our understanding and our limited brain capacity that prevents us from grokking that, if you will, from really understanding that?
No, it's actually more the fact that we can understand certain effects leaves room for more brain power, so leaves room for open observations that have nothing to do with the current status we are currently living in, but allow us for learning.
I think that may be the point that David Deutsch was making.
I was literally just going
Yes.
to say that. So that's one of the points that Brett Hall and David Deutsch make, and I would suggest the fabric of reality and the beginning of infinity to flesh that out more.
By the way, when you were talking about throwing spheres, I suddenly realized that we are not very good intuitive physicists in the sense that Newton's laws even are counterintuitive. I mean,
How so?
well, you throw a sphere and it eventually comes to. But if it were not for friction, I mean, a moving object, according to Newton's laws, would go on forever. So that's counterintuitive, and that's middle world. That's the world of spear throwing. But we have our intuitive physics is as it were pre-Newtonian.
So we've evolved to develop those capacities.
Yes, and Newton's insights are actually very counterintuitive. They go against our innate physics.
Okay, great. Thank you for your question. Next, please speak into the mic and state your question.
Good evening. I was wondering, referring back to your point about incremental evolution, if sometimes you'd reach, quote unquote, like a dead end, you increment to something where there's no more space to grow. And if so, if like for humans, for example, there would be gene editing to help solve that, or if you have any views on that or any thoughts?
I suppose it probably does happen. Yes, I imagine it can happen that there's no space to go. One of the things that, I mean, it requires mutational variation in order for natural selection to have something to work on. If there's no mutations, you could never. I mean, if you might ask why don't we develop wings like angels on our backs? And it's possible that the reason is that the necessary mutations have never arisen. Probably most biologists would say that. I'm not sure I would, but most of them would.
Okay, thank you for your question. Hi.
Hi, I'm a sociolinguist myself, and I was wondering, because you were talking about those clockwork urges earlier as well, and I was wondering how that then relates to social sciences as a thing, because of course social scientists research those urges that people sometimes don't even realize they have, or actions they don't even realize they do. Are those social scientists then evolutionary biologists, but then focused on humans, or maybe the other way around? And how do you see that relation?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not a social scientist. Perhaps you can answer that question.
Well, I don't know either. That's why I was hoping.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, actually. Are you saying, is social science an evolutionary science?
In essence, yes, because we're all doing those clockwork urges, whatever they are,
yes,
constantly, perhaps, without even realizing. Language itself might be one of those. Communicating, is that?
Yes. Language interests me very much. I suppose we know that humans have a genetic predisposition to learn language, but the specific language we learn is different depending upon our environment. What am I saying? I'm not quite sure what you're asking. That's the trouble.
Yeah. So we'll kind of. I just want to say something really quick. So often when you go to these talks, someone will ask a question, and then the person will just basically bullshit you, just make something up. I don't know is always a great answer, and we need to create cultures where people, particularly people in authority, are more comfortable with saying "I don't know." I don't know is a fantastic answer.
Yeah, that's right.
And if we do that collectively, we can create a culture where people don't pretend to know things they don't know.
Yeah, I quite agree with that, but there's a difference in I don't know and I don't understand. And,
yeah.
And I'm happy to say I don't know, but in this case, I think there may be an interesting question that I haven't got, but probably wouldn't have a good answer to anyway, because I think social science is very interesting, but it probably is not really studied in an evolutionary way, not in a genetic way anyway.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. step right up to the mic and say your question.
Good evening. I'm impressed with your vast knowledge of science and biology, for that matter. But I also have a young daughter, and I would like to spark the same fascination with her. What if you could choose as something I could share with her to get her the same fascination I enjoy?
Something to share. How old is she?
8.
8. Very nice age. Well, do you mean a book or
More something like an anecdote or a fact or what you could say and impress her.
Well, I wish I had written a book for 8-year-olds, in which case I would plug it. I've written a book for, shall we say, 12-year-olds, and a very bright 8-year-old.
The magic of reality.
If you were to read to her The Magic of Reality, which is my only children's book, I would be very delighted. It's got nice pictures too.
Thank you for your question. I'll just add something quickly to that. In Freakonomics, is an interesting story. If you want your kids to read, don't read to them, have them watch you read. If you want your kids not to smoke, don't really tell them not to smoke. Just model the behaviors that you want them to emulate. Okay. Hello.
Hello, good evening. My overall question is, how do we popularize atheism and critical scientific thinking? And my sub-question is, how do we do that without creating institutions and power structures with following typical corruption and their dogmas of their own?
Yes. I'm not very good at answering the question of how you influence people. I try to do it, but I have been criticized for just sort of telling people what I think is true and not performing a sufficiently seductive operation. I think Peter's made it more of a specialism of how to persuade people. I've been criticized by both Lawrence Krauss and Neil deGrasse Tyson for not indulging in an act of persuasion, but according to them, more or less saying, well, if you don't agree with me, you're an idiot. And I try not to do actually that. But if you Google Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, you probably come up with a clip where he berated me in public for this, and very eloquently. And I replied, it was rather running out of time. I replied, I gratefully accept the rebuke, which raised a great bellow of laughter from him. He's a very humorous man. But then I said, well, I'm not the worst person in this respect, because I asked the editor of New Scientist, who at that time was Alan Anderson, what is your policy at New Scientist? And he said, our policy at New Scientist is this: science is interesting. If you don't agree, you can fuck off.
Okay, we have enough for one more question, maybe two, probably just the last one.
Hi, good evening. I was wondering if you could help me settle a debate with some of my friends. The periodical cicada is sometimes referred to as nature's prime number generator because it emerges every 17 or 19 years. The evolutionary pressure that led to that, what do you think it is?
You're from Ireland, aren't you?
I'm from Northern Ireland.
Yes, yeah. Well, this is very interesting. There is a theory for why these periodical cicadas come out every 17, 19 years. They're prime numbers. And the theory is, and it's a magnificent theory, but it's perhaps too magnificent to be really believable. In the arms race between cicadas and predators, if they came out say every 2 years or every 4 years, then the predators could time their cycles to coincide with them.
Interesting.
And the thing about a prime number is it's very hard to do that, because you can't do it by doing it every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years. You won't hit them if they come out a prime number of years. I think that might be just a bit too far-fetched, but it's the only theory I've heard, and it's a beautiful one.
Interesting. If it's very, very quick, and before, if you have a VIP ticket, please remain seated. Yes, sir. Very quickly.
Good evening. I'm as happy to meet you as you would be if you met Charles Darwin. In your book, An Appetite for Wonder, you briefly explored the idea that our paths in life could be shaped either entirely by the circumstances we're born into or by something like a magnetic pull towards what we're meant to become. Given your life's journey and the many years since you wrote that, do you still lean more towards one of these possibilities, or has your view changed? Thank you.
I didn't hear that.
So, can you say it in a sentence?
In the last chapter of your book, An Appetite for Wonder, you explore two possibilities. Our life is either determined by our circumstances completely.
Oh, yes.
Or there's a magnetic pull. I quote.
Oh, yes,
magnetic
got it. Okay.
pull. What do you think now?
This is the first of my 2 autobiographies, and I was kind of speculating the way people do, the way one does. What were the things that made my life happen the way it was? If I hadn't taken this path, if I hadn't been sent to such and such a school, which I almost wasn't, would my entire life be different? If I hadn't met Nico Tinbergen when I did, would I have gone into... I probably would have gone into biochemistry instead of into animal behavior, and my entire life would have been different. So all our lives are, or may be, determined by these more or less random events which just happen to push us one way or the other. And I was wondering whether that's it, or whether there is a magnetic pull back to what we were going to do anyway. So, for example, if I had not met Nico Tinbergen and instead had gone into biochemical research instead of animal behavior, would I have ended up writing similar books to the ones I did write? Because a magnetic pull would have pulled me back into that sphere. And I genuinely don't know, and I think it's a very interesting question that every one of us can ask. If we hadn't met our spouse, if we hadn't, well, goodness me, and the accident of our parents happening to mate at a particular time, and a particular sperm happening to hit instead of another sperm. I mean, we're all incredibly lucky to be here. You think about it. Shall I recite the Aldous Huxley poem, which I'll end up by reciting this poem? Aldous Huxley wrote this poem to express exactly this point. 1,000,000 spermatozoa, all of them alive. Out of their cataclysm, but one poor Noah dare hope to survive. And of that billion minus one might have chanced to be Shakespeare, another Newton, a new Donne. But the one was me. Shame to have ousted your betters thus, taking ark while the others remained outside. Better for all of us, froward homunculus, if you'd quietly died.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Dawkins. Thank you. Thank you.